Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to a new unit on sociocultural theories. Before we begin, I want to note that this PowerPoint, as with most of the other PowerPoints, is derived primarily from one of my friends and colleagues, Suraj Uttamchandani, who has spent a lot of time kind of thinking about these and teaching these in these courses, in the educational psychology courses, and much of the design that I've implemented comes from him with some of my own flavoring as well. So I just want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. I want to say as we jump into sociocultural theory that I am very biased. I love sociocultural theory. I identify as a sociocultural theorist, or that is the theory that most resonates with me as a learner, as a teacher. And I think that sociocultural theory is at the heart of the learning sciences. It's at the heart of contemporary learning theory. So this is going to be a more challenging unit. It's a little bit denser, and it's because sociocultural theory approaches learning and in a way that is kind of different than how you've been thinking about it in your life, probably more intuitively. I want you to stick with it though, because I really do believe that if you can get sociocultural theory to click for you, it will be like game changer, life changer way of thinking about learning. And in this course, we're just going to kind of get you a start on that path. We may not get there to the life changing part of it, but if you can just start to feel and see how these differences can be powerful, that would be a good place. So welcome to sociocultural theory. All right, so before you got here, you should have taken, or you should have annotated the Vygotsky piece. After teaching this course for a number of years, really nobody explains the idea of zone of proximal development clearer than Vygotsky himself. And it's nice to read primary sources. He is the one who came up with this idea of the zone of proximal development. So you should already be a little bit familiar with the idea of zone of proximal development from that Vygotsky article or chapter from a book. So in this PowerPoint, in this presentation, I just want to give you a little bit of context for sociocultural theory. Make sure that we get that ZPD idea down, because everything else in this entire module is going to kind of build on the ZPD, build on that zone of proximal development. So let's make sure we got it, okay? Okay, so here are some of the central issues that come up in sociocultural theory kind of more broadly. Central issues one central issue is that children seem to learn quite deeply from interacting with their caregivers. So interaction seems like a really key part of learning that we don't yet fully understand in this course, because the other theories that we've discussed so far have not really talked too much about this interaction piece. So it's also important to understand that what a child can do independently doesn't seem to tell the whole story. Again, prior theories that we've discussed have kind of seemed to talk a little bit more about what the individual can do, but it doesn't seem to tell the whole story. For example, there are some activities which one person cannot do alone, typo, like playing on a soccer team, like the example here, that require multiple participants, or maybe like playing in an orchestra. Those are, we don't really have theories that help us understand that too much yet. And then sometimes people encode material, to use a little bit of the cognitive terms, encode material in the way that we've been talking about this past week, but they lacked important cultural contexts needed to make that material make sense. So, for example, the difference between tú and usted in Spanish, there's some cultural context that you might need to understand to be able to apply those a little bit more usefully, or more correctly, or more accurately based on the context. Or we might think about other words that somebody might know, like an internet slang thing. I think we used the "okay boomer" in an example before. So you can encode and and learn a meaning of a word, but not necessarily know how to use it correctly. That happens a lot. There are lots of words that we kind of know what it means, but we're not really quite sure how to use it. So those are some of the central issues or things that sociocultural theorists say. Cognitive theory doesn't really account for some of these things. So, I keep saying sociocultural theory, but as we kind of look at this little diagram on the right, I really kind of want us to think about this a little bit more like sociocultural theories, as in multiple. It's a kind of a family of various perspectives that share a social and cultural orientation to learning. Learning as primarily social. In this class, we're going to focus on Vygotskian theory, and it's going to be at the center here. Coming off Vygotskian theory, next we'll move to cultural historical activity theory. Sometimes it's called activity theory, sometimes they call it chat. And this will add a little bit to our understanding, and then separately, in another part of the module, we'll talk about situated cognition, or situative theory or situativity. Those are kind of different terms for that same thing. And that kind of has to do with something called a community of practice, enculturation. So those together, I'll sometimes call sociocultural theory to refer to kind of all of those together. Or sometimes I'll say sociocultural theories when we're trying to tease out differences. For us, it's not that important that you know the differences between these, but I think having these different names will help you understand why some of the theories don't necessarily go together or seem like one unified theory, but rather kind of various perspectives on the same core idea. And that core idea is that learning is fundamentally social. And again, we're going to talk more about this. Social does not have to mean another with other people. It often does mean that, but that's not necessarily what we mean by social. And again, we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go. Okay, so Vygotsky, the guy for sociocultural theory. He was a social psychologist in the Soviet Union in the early 1900s. So his work was, he was actually a contemporary of Piaget and Skinner. He kind of came before them and had these ideas before them. But we didn't really know about him in North America because his work doesn't get translated into English because he was in the Soviet Union. And for some other reasons, the work was kind of not able to get out there until the 1970s. And so when that work is first translated into English, it kind of changes everything for the study of learning in North America. And the central idea for Vygotsky has to do with that interaction that I mentioned on the previous slide. Children seem to learn quite deeply from interacting with their caregivers. And you kind of read a little bit about that in the reading. And we'll, again, keep digging into that and trying to understand that idea of interaction, this social piece. So what I want you to do to try and make some sense of this is I want you to pause the video and I want you to try and draw the ZPD. See if you can draw a visual representation of the ZPD. This is a little thing called the generation effect. You should have read about that already in the previous unit. So this doesn't really work if you don't pause the video and don't try it. So pause the video, give it a go. Think about what if I tried to draw a visual representation of the ZPD, what would it look like? Okay, pause the video. Did you pause? Pause. Okay. Now, same or similar thing. I want you to pause and write down in your own words, what do you think, what is the definition for the ZPD? What, in your own words, how would you define the ZPD, the zone of proximal development? Okay? Okay. So stick with me on this. Again, what you did in the previous two slides is just to kind of help you try and figure it out yourself, work with it a little bit. Now we're going to kind of go in and see what we can add to it. Here's a model that is somewhat common. I've seen it used before. So, okay, stick with me. So things I can do independently. There's some things you can do on your own. You don't need anybody else to help you with them. You can just do them, right? Then there's kind of this red zone of things that you can't do. Even if you had as much help in the world, you're not developmentally there yet. It might be helpful to think about a child. That there's no matter how much help I try to give a child. I have a 1-month-old. No matter how much help I try to give them, they just can't speak yet. They're just not developmentally there yet. And again, this is easier to think about as a child, but this also applies to things later in life. And think about maybe things in your own life that no matter how much help you got, you wouldn't be able to do them. Okay, so how do we get from this green zone to this red zone? Or a better way to phrase that, actually, is how do we get from this red zone? How do we get things that we can't do, no matter how much help we have, to become things that we can do by ourselves? Okay, well, the answer is this. Okay, this is the set of things in between, things that you can only do with help. Things I can do only with help, but that eventually I may be able to do on my own. Okay, and in that yellow zone, for us, is the zone of proximal development. Okay, that set of things that you can do only with the help of a more knowledgeable other is the zone of proximal development. So according to Vygotsky, important big developmental learning leaps are most likely to take place when the learner is in the zone of proximal development, when they're at the very edge of their competence. Okay, when they're trying to do things that they can't do without help. All right, when their reach is being extended through engagement with the social plane. And again, when I say social plane, I mean more knowledgeable other, like another person, interaction with another person. But I'm also talking about social tools, like the readings that we have throughout the week, videos, other tools that we might interact with. And again, as we think about learning some more, maybe some more tools will kind of come to mind. So social engagement that can extend your reach from things you can do independently to things that you can do with help, that is beyond the things that you can do independently. Okay? So your reach is extended by a more knowledgeable social other. Then you're in their zone of proximal development. So when we want the student to learn something really deep or powerful or complex, we want to make sure that they're learning in their zone of proximal development. We don't want them to do things they can do independently. We don't want to be teaching them those things because they already know how to do those things. We want to focus on those things that they can't yet do without some help. So I'd like to use this kind of analogy of a claw grabber. Okay, this claw grabber tool. And that tool allows you to reach something that you couldn't reach on your own, right? So think about it this way. Like the social other, the more knowledgeable other that you're working with, right, is like the tool that can extend your reach so that you can reach something that you couldn't reach on your own. Eventually, your green zone kind of expands. Eventually, you appropriate from that interaction. I should have added an animation to see the green zone kind of expand a little bit, because now you're able to do more things independently. Okay, so eventually you appropriate, and we'll talk more about appropriation later, but you appropriate from that interaction, that help, and your green zone grows, okay? So next we're going to transition to think a little bit more about the ZPD, and we're going to kind of do a self-test to make sure this idea is kind of gelling for you. Turn my camera back on, or turn it on for this part so you can see me a little bit. So again, I want to make sure that you understand the ZPD, this zone of proximal development, fairly deeply. So before we dive in, the zone of proximal development, it's not ZDP. In fact, I probably am going to encourage you, even though I keep using ZPD throughout this presentation, I'm going to encourage you to say zone of proximal development rather than ZPD. until you kind of know what that means. Because sometimes we kind of say these acronyms without really understanding what they mean. And zone of proximal development has some meaning. So I want you to try and use that. Okay, so for the rest of this video, what we're going to do is just kind of a true-false quiz. I'm going to give a statement. You're going to say true or false. So I want you to pause the video, think about it, and then I'll talk out my answer and move to the next slide. Okay, you don't necessarily need to add any annotations unless you have some specific questions that you want to ask. So you don't need to add an annotation saying, this is what I think it is, true or false. No need to do that because I'm going to explain it, but if you have questions, feel free to post those questions as annotations. Okay? Okay, first claim, and I've added the diagram of the ZPD here in all of these true-false statements in case it has some usefulness to you as you think about it. So true or false, you know somebody has learned when they have a bigger ZPD. So pause the video and think about that, true or false. Okay, so this is kind of tricky, okay? So I'm going to say false, but I'm going to try and explain why as we look at the diagram here, okay? So if somebody has learned something, meaning they've appropriated or internalized or whatever it is that they're doing, like that was happening in the social interaction, now they can do it independently. This green zone is going to grow, right? If they've learned something, if they've appropriated, internalized, whatever, then this green zone, they'll now be able to do something independently that they couldn't have done independently before, right? Does that kind of make a little bit of sense? So this green zone is going to get a little bit bigger. Now, it might be that the yellow zone also gets a little bit bigger. Oftentimes, right, when we learn something new that we can do on our own, it opens up new possibilities for us. And so maybe we could say even that the red grows a little bit smaller and the yellow grows a little bit bigger, maybe. So it's kind of, when we think about learning though, typically we want to think about this green zone, things that they can do independently, because the goal of the zone of proximal development, or the reason why we're targeting the zone of proximal development, is to help them be able to do things on their own. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that the yellow zone gets bigger. Could be that the green zone expands, but the yellow zone stays the same for now. So you know somebody has learned when they have a bigger ZPD doesn't really make sense. Instead, you know somebody has learned when they have a bigger green zone, right? When they had a bigger green zone, that means they've learned, and when they're able to demonstrate that mastery independently. However, if someone's ZPD has expanded, that necessarily means that their green zone has expanded, right? If their ZPD has expanded, it's because their actual developmental level has increased a little bit too. So here's my point. So as teachers, for me, my goal is not to make your ZPD get bigger. That's typically a developmental thing. But our goal instead is to engage students at the edge of their competence, doing things that they can't do without help. They have to have help in order to accomplish them, so that they can appropriate those, so they can internalize those actions, those whatever it happens to be, from our social interaction. So as a teacher, I'm going to try and do those things to get you to right in the edge of your competence, trying to make you work really, really hard in some ways, right? So I know this doesn't totally make sense yet, but just stick with this idea. So the goal is not to make the ZPD bigger. The goal is to engage the student at the edge of their competence. The goal is to have the students constantly be working on their ZPD, or in their ZPD. Okay. So again, in their ZPD, not on their ZPD. All right. Again, a little confusing. Let's move on to the next one. Learning in the ZPD is easy. True or false? Okay, I think I gave this away in the last one, right? Because they're working at the edge of their competence. No, it's not easy. Learning, in fact, and again, Vygotsky said, important big leaps in learning take place when the learner is in their zone of proximal development. this is hard stuff, right? It could be easy, maybe it could be easy, but when you're in your ZPD at the very edge, you're right up to where you can do things on your own, but you need help, and so so it is harder. It's not necessarily easy. Okay, you're pushing yourself. Now it could be fun, right? Fun is totally different than easy. We want to make sure there's a distinction here between learning is fun and learning is easy. Okay, it could be fun and it could be hard. Those are not mutually exclusive, right? So it could be fun to be working maybe with another person or collaborating or working on a complex problem, something that's hard. But I don't want you to think that the ZPD is like the easiest form of learning, okay? In a lot of ways, it's the hardest in terms of difficulty, okay? Okay, now moving on, again, true or false, the ZPD measures your potential developmental level. True or false? Okay, this is true. This is exactly true. And you can see Vygotsky talk about the ZPD this way. So the green zone is your actual developmental level. The yellow zone is the zone of potential development, right? Or the zone of proximal development, as he calls it. Right? Now, one of the big findings for Vygotsky was, of course, that different people who had the same actual developmental level, had the same green zone, same things that they could do independently, actually had different zones of proximal development. Okay, they had a different developmental level. So, but what this also means is that if we really want to think about a person's knowledge, we need to think about their knowledge in social action with others, rather than simply their knowledge in a box or in an abstract way. It's not just what they can know and do totally in the abstract. There's this social aspect that, again, hasn't really been addressed in these other theories that we've talked about so far. Okay, so yes, this is true. Moving on, true or false? You could be in your ZPD even if you're all by yourself. True or false? You can be in your ZPD even if you are all by yourself. Okay, this one is also a little bit tricky because it kind of depends on what we mean by all by yourself. So this is kind of true-ish, false-ish, right? So even if you're all by yourself, you can be in your ZPD if you're engaging with a social other. Now, again, I'm talking about social other in maybe a different way than we would normally think about it, right? We typically think about social other as another person, but it doesn't have to be another person, right? So another tool, you could use some sort of tool, like another kind of social entity. So this video might be acting as a social other for you, right? You might be totally alone in your apartment or wherever you happen to be, at home or something. You might be interacting with this totally on your own, but you're interacting with this video. So this video can actually serve as a social other for you, in that it hopefully is extending your understanding, it's extending your reach. I'm trying to push you to think about the zone of proximal development. It's a little bit meta that hopefully at some point you'll be able to describe the zone of proximal development on your own, right? But right now you probably need some help to be able to work through this. So, this happens a lot with other things like YouTube, or you watch a documentary or you read a book. Those could be other types of things. So like this happens to me all the time with like car type stuff. I can't do a lot of car type stuff independently. I need some sort of social other. But that doesn't mean I need to go to the mechanic to have them teach me. That could be one way of doing it. But I also have access to YouTube, and I can pull up a video and I can see descriptions and watch somebody work through the how to do it. And so I can use that as kind of a social other and figure out how to do things that I would not be able to do without help. Okay, so this is kind of really fundamental. Again, there could be other things, maybe a calculator or a computer program or a graph, or lots of different things could be a social tool. anything that was created by somebody else or has somebody else's ideas in it, right? Then you can't possibly do in your ZPD, because the ZPD requires that you be working with social others to extend your reach. So if you're totally alone, all by yourself with nothing else in the room, just your person, then okay, no windows, no doors, no objects in it, then I guess no, you can't be in your ZPD by yourself. But in most cases, when we say all by ourselves, we are just meaning without other people around. And in that case, we can still be in our ZPD. Okay, true or false? The notion of the ZPD suggests that learning is fundamentally social. True or false? Okay, the notion that the ZPD suggests that learning is fundamentally social, yes, capital T, true. This is the catalyst that kind of changes everything. This is what sociocultural theory is all about. ZPDs vary based on how they engage in social interaction, right? That tells us that learning has to do with an individual's engagement in a social group or a social collective. And again, social doesn't always mean other persons, but even these other tools are created by other persons. So in some ways, yes, it's still other persons, but we want to think about it doesn't always have to be another person in the room. So the abbreviated version of that is just that learning is fundamentally social. That means for us, as learning theorists, that behaviorism, cognitive theory, social cognitive theory, they're not enough, because they tend to focus fundamentally on the learner as an individual, rather than always thinking about what is around them, the context which they're in, and how that interaction with the context, which means other people, other objects, other tools. So we need to understand one learner as part of a group of learners, a social group, or a learning group. So yes, it's true. The idea of the ZPD suggests that learning is fundamentally social in nature. Last one. I know we're going way more time than I wanted to take, but hopefully this is kind of, again, this unit is hard. So true or false, all learning takes place in the ZPD. True or false? Feel free to pause and think about it. All learning takes place in the ZPD. Okay, so this is kind of another tricky one. So like, let's say you learn a new word from a book that you're reading. Now, I just told you that you can think about a book as a social other, or these, other kinds of tools you can think about as a social other. So maybe that is learning in the ZPD. For our purposes, you might learn a new word or something that's not at the very edge of your competence, right? You're just simply interacting with the world, and you pick up some new piece of information. You encode some new piece of information. That's all fine and well. So what I want to highlight, though, and the power of the ZPD, is that the best learning, the deepest learning, the learning of complex things, the learning of how to participate in social interaction, all of that takes place in the ZPD. So for Vygotsky, it's not that all learning takes place in the ZPD, it's that big developmental leaps, big leaps in your thinking, leaps in your ability happen when you are in your ZPD. So not all learning necessarily, but it's the kind of learning that we're often going for in schools. Okay, so as we wrap up here, who cares about the ZPD? What's the point of the ZPD? In particular for teaching, and maybe think about you as a learner as well in your other classes that you're taking or other classes that you've taken before now. So the point of the ZPD is that you want to meet learners at the very edge of their competence. And so it's important to know what learners can do independently and what they're not going to be able to do, even if you gave them all the help in the world. So you want to target your activities for learners to be in their ZPD, right? So if this self-test was all very obvious to you, then you're not in your ZPD, right? That means you already had known the material, and this might not have been the best use of your time. If the test was completely beyond you, no matter how much help I was giving, you weren't ready to make sense of these ideas, then you were in that red zone. Also not helpful, but it's kind of like Goldilocks, right? Like ideally we got it exactly right there in the middle where this really helped crystallize something for you because you were in your zone of proximal development. You were at the very edge of your understanding, and that's where we want most students to be at most of the time in a classroom that we're teaching, or again, as a learner ourselves. That's kind of where we want to be as well. And we can use collaboration. We can use other tools, we can use ourselves, we can use worksheets, we can use various items that function as a social other to extend our reach, to make sure that the learner is in there, whether to make sure we're in our ZPD, or as a teacher, we can make sure that the learner is in their ZPD. So we should create opportunities to do that. We want to focus on appropriation and mediation, which I know we haven't really talked about yet. We're going to talk about in the next section. But again, I've taken way more time than I needed to this time. The next videos will be shorter, but thank you for sticking with this, trying to make sense of it. Again, make sure you leave any annotations for questions on the video so that I can try and help clarify some of it, or at least point you to other resources, or say, don't worry, that's coming. All right, see you in the next video.